see? No, I mean, I've known this all along, and Jim has jumped onto this because he saw something. He said, hey, these letters are Greek. I said, yeah, well, he said there's 6 or 7 they can't work out that look like Greek. Now, if you read Julius Caesar's De Bellico alphabet, are very similar. If you read Ammianus Marcellinus, he says the Greek alphabet there. Now, that's not too far distant from the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is it? So I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are in Cumric.
Well, maybe you better have a look at this.
Nothing I can do about it. That's the inevitable result. You say, oh, hell, I've not thought about it. And so it's not impossible that, that you spend another 3 years just trying to get photographs of from idiots. I mean, I have to say, I know you've put work in college, I don't mean to be rude, but I've become very, I'm not antagonistic, but I've got an antipathy towards universities,
Generally speaking, we do too.
I have an antipathy because the attitude generally is appalling.
We have long said that it's, and it's one of the major problems, and I'm sure it's that way in our country, but they're judging from our own university and others, they're terribly provincial, terribly closed-minded, and have very few thoughts that are.
Well, I think a lot of people talk to young people who are bright and on the way up, and because they're young, they're talking to 20, 30 bright, intelligent young minds in the class, but they're not educated minds. And you can convince yourself that you're very clever. Well, actually, you're not clever than they are. They're just not the way you are yet. And I think there's a tendency for some people to think that they're, cleverer than they are, and to see everybody else and anybody else as having nothing to say on this. That's just an opinion. I know it's not. It doesn't apply to everybody, but it does apply. And I think, do I want to get into this damn cave, and do I want to get into the Dead Sea Scrolls, and or shouldn't I just get an agent and do what I've done? I don't know. I think that really we want to try and sell what we've done. No, I don't think I should go and authenticate this cave for nothing. Would you? Or would you?
No.
Name Dangle. See, Jim sees this as a crusade. I'm not on a crusade. I won't let him have a copy of the film, right, because of his wife. Right? Okay. And if I feel a bit awkward about things, then I'm not going to have anything with that bloody woman. Right? Yeah. So if anything happens to him, you don't know what happened to me. So, that's it. What do we do? Should we start?
You want me to switch chairs?
Yeah.
What do you want me to say? What do you want me to say? What are we going to do first?
I think we're just going to do the thing with Alan.
A partnership, right? And if I die, the partner is still alive, possibly, right? Unless he dies before I do. So we've got to get that on tape that I'm one of a partnership, right?
Okay. You want to name the name?
Oh, I'll name the partner. Obviously, he's well known in the books. So we work that way. But having said that, I think I'll tell you roughly what I've said about the importance of this alphabet, because nothing works without it. It's the key to everything.
How did you develop your work with the alphabet?
How did I develop my work with it?
Yeah, how did you get started working with the Coelbren?
Well, the first thing we did was to prove that the history was largely correct. And then we said, well, if the history's largely correct, and this is not a forged, false, fabricated history, then it's highly unlikely that the alphabet's forged and fabricated. If the history's true and correct, the alphabet's probably a perfectly true and a correct and viable piece of history. Then it's fairly obvious that you have a mighty weapon in your hand. You have a tool, because with the alphabet and its cipher, if you know which sign is A, which is CH, which is W, which is B, which is whatever, you then have a mighty weapon with which to unlock the past by reading the inscriptions. So the first thing to do, obviously, was to tackle the inscriptions in the UK. And once we'd done that, and we had an idea that obviously it worked, and that it was a correct alphabet with a correct cipher. In other words, the definition of which letter of the modern alphabet matched the old symbol of the Coelbren Alphabet, was producing words, coherent statements that were historically, verifiable, that you could tie them into history, to the area where they were, and to the date at which the stone apparently was set up, on stone. You were straight into a historical context. So we then were able to say, well, if it works in Britain on inscriptions, if this alphabet appears in other countries where we know our ancestral stories say it ought to be, then surely we've got a tie-up in that if our ancestors come from Phrygian Turkey, the Trojan area, and there are inscriptions in the same alphabet there, the same language would apply. If people went from Phrygian Turkey, Trojan area, to Etruria in Italy, and the same alphabet is there, then that should translate as well. In other words, all these people are speaking the same language. Now, once we got to that simple line of thought, it's merely about a matter of going back along the path. And the obvious analogy is that people came out of the United Kingdom, they went to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, America, everywhere, and they took their English language from Britain, and they took the same alphabet with them. Because the people in New Zealand don't speak Maori and write in sign language, they speak English. And the people in America, they don't speak Algonquin or Sioux, and they don't write, in weird scripts on sticks. They speak English. They write in the modern script. Therefore, that's what happened in antiquity. Does that make sense?
Sure.
All right. When do you want to start this?
Anytime.
Okay. We can stop if we want to.
Anytime you want to start or stop.
Fine. Okay, do you want to go?
Right.
Right. My name's Alan Wilson, as you well know, and I operate with a partner, Anthony Blackett, and we have set ourselves up in the field of history, for the study and pursuance of history, historical knowledge. And one of the things we set up was a partnership, the MTP partnership. So I operate through the MTP partnership on equal terms with Blackett. Anthony Blackett's well known from the books which we jointly publish. Now, one of the major things that we've done in our studies is to delve into the ancient history of the Brits. Now, in delving into ancient British history, we found a peculiarity. In modern times, it's been regarded as a bogus history. And the reason for it being a bogus history comes out of Oxford and Cambridge and London in England. And the theory was that Troy never existed other than in the mind of Homer. And as Homer wrote a fictitious poem about Troy, Troy was a fictitious place. It had no foundation in fact or truth and was non-existent. Therefore, a history which based itself upon the first king of Britain being Brutus, the great-grandson of Anchises and grandson of Aeneas of Troy, and that the whole of the British nation were originally, or a large part of them were originally Trojan, had to be a false history. As it was a false history based on Homer's fictional epic, therefore you throw out British history. And this actually was done. And you will find books by these supposed scholars from Oxford and elsewhere stating this in the words that I've just stated. That it's a bogus history based on a bogus fiction by Homer, that this is a brutal, primitive race who had no real history of their own, a bunch of savages, and they decided they would claim descent from Troy. Now, how this lunacy could have taken root in the 19th century is perhaps hard to understand. But you've got to realize that in the United Kingdom, the word united doesn't really apply. It's a very fragmented, fratricidal place where all sorts of petty jealousies and major jealousies are consistently to the fore in the relations between the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh and the English. Everybody seeks primacy and jealously attacks and niggles at the others. So what you start with in British history is a situation that the history is thoroughly derided before William the Conqueror. And this is the well-known phrase in Britain of, it all began in 1066. In other words, you couldn't believe anything that happened before 1066. Now this leads to a peculiar situation. You get modern professors, and I've read a book recently, I've read several, but one last year, where a professor of archaeology actually states, we know nothing of British history whatsoever other than the snippets and small comments made by various Greek and Roman writers. Now that is an inconceivably stupid statement. You could equally say we know nothing of what the Jews, or the history of the Jews, other than what Roman or Greek writers said about the Jews. In other words, you know nothing of the Jews. Now you know about the Jews because you know of the various histories and documents preserved by the Jews. The Bible, the Talmud, Flavius Josephus, and so on. And we don't say to the Jews, you have no history, because the Greeks and the Romans didn't mention you. And we don't go to China and say to the Chinese, you have no history, because the Greeks and Romans didn't write about you, nor do we do it to the Japanese. Each nation preserves its own history. And really, if you dig up in ancient Assyria and you find the monuments of Assyria with their inscriptions and the libraries of various kings on cuneiform clay tablets, you are reading the self-preserved histories of Assyria, and the same in Chaldean Babylonia. So why Britain should be singled out and put into a bracket where we are told you cannot have original British records and British inscribed stones of antiquity, British coins and British artifacts, the whole archaeology of Britain and history of Britain, unless it's verified by some Roman or Greek who did not visit the country and who wrote, say, 300 to 500 years after the events he's describing. Very difficult to understand. So it's a double standard which has come in, and it's come in through petty political jealousies and political motivations in the United Kingdom. So what was happening when this Trojan epic had to be abandoned in Britain was that it was in the early 1800s, beginning of the 19th century. You just had the American Revolution, or War of Independence, tearing itself away from the Brits. On the British throne was a very unpopular German monarchy. George III was stark raving mad, although they tried to portray him otherwise. He had six fat debauched sons whose performance around London with loose women and morganatic marriages and gross behaviour was very unpopular. The whole damn monarchy was in disrepute. The ruling elite, ruling class needed a puppet monarchy. They were still smarting under the effect of the Jacobite rebellion, where Bonnie Prince Charlie attempted to oust these Hanoverians in the 1745-1750 era. The French had risen on their hind legs and finally got rid of the aristocracy, and they got rid of the king, and there were guillotines everywhere. And it was in this frantic environment in Britain that the decision was taken to get rid of past British history, because it was very necessary to create a bogus history and to eliminate anything that was a threat to the regime and the monarchy. And you've got to realise also that 50% of the British population are estimated to have supported the French Revolution, and at least 50%, if not more, were fully in support of the American Revolution. And this probably is not realised outside the UK. So one of the targets was to abandon the ancient history of the country and to create a history that would shore up the monarchy and protect the establishment. So having gone into that in that way, the detail can be researched by anybody. In particular, there was an assault upon the Welsh, because it was in Wales that the histories were mainly preserved. The Welsh had been in their territories for 3,600 years, and they said very firmly, as did many of the Brits in England, that they were people of two migrations. One, a vast migration by sea from Syria, about 1600 years BC, coming from, presumably from from Diocletian, who turns out to be Dungi of and the second migration about 500 BC from a Trojan remnant in the western Asia Minor area, Phrygian Troja. And so we had two migrations, one 3,600 years ago, one 2,500 years ago, coming into the UK, bringing these influences from that area. These histories were forthwith abandoned purely on the basis that Troy never existed. So, about 130 years after they abandoned the Albion legend, the coming of Albine from Syria, Leonard Woolley dug up Ur of the Chaldees, and he dug up the royal necropolis. In digging up the royal necropolis, he dug up the vast tombs of the emperors of Ur. And one of them is of interest to us in that it's the greatest of the emperors, who they think is of the third dynasty, named Dungi, who appears to be the British Diocletian. The interesting thing is that in the British record, written on manuscripts certainly 1,000 years old, the idea was that Diocletian ruled 33 other nations. He also made his daughters rulers of nations or territories. And he had a great enemy named Labana. When Woolley dug up Ur, he found the Vultivarian of Diocletian, and he also found that Diocletian, or Dungi, ruled 33 other countries. He made some of his daughters rulers of countries, and he had a great enemy named Labana. Labana turns out to be the first king of the Hittites, emperor of the Hittites up in Anatolian Turkey, who did actually attack the Chaldean Euphrates civilization and recorded it. Every subsequent king of the Hittites took the throne name of Labana, in the same way as the Caesars in Rome became Caesar after Julius Caesar. In other words, Caesar became a titular name as well as a personal name. Everybody used it. Not until around 1880 was the Hittite Empire rediscovered, and so nobody in Europe would have known anything about Labana, yet the British knew all about Labana 1,000 years ago. Yet the British knew all about Labana 1,000 years ago. When Woolley dug up the Vultivaria in the tomb of Dungi, he found metal tables. On the metal tables he found that there were certain items, reclining models of rams, reclining models of bulls, standing lambs, round balls. When they dug up the Lexden Mound in Cambridgeshire in England, said to be the tomb of King Kinvelin, within the Lexden Mound they found a metal table in the vaultive area, reclining bulls, reclining model rams, reclining and standing lambs, and round balls again. In other words, a complete identical paraphernalia in the religious area. All these items are still in the Colchester Museum. But it seems not to have occurred to anybody to make the comparison. So there is some truth in the first legend, and you can take it further. You can compare the ancient measurements, jurisprudence, pottery, and in Britain, at the time of this invasion, 1600 BC, a marvellous metalworking culture burst out from nowhere. It had no antecedents, it had no precedents, there was no way that it could be traced back to a sort of development. It just came out of nowhere. And it's not unlikely that this metalworking culture, known as the Wessex culture, is a direct emanation of this invasion from Ur of the Chaldees. And if you begin to compare some of the marvellous gold and other bronze finds that they've made in ancient mounds and so on in Britain, if you make the comparison with ancient Syrian Ur of the Chaldees, you will see that there is remarkable similarities. So you have an imported culture, an imported civilization, imported technology, in the same thing that's happened to the United States in the last 200 years, or more. Taking this a stage further, if there appears to be some basic truth in the Syrian migration, you also have mentions that in the Odyssey, said again to be by Homer, but I doubt it, where Ulysses talks to a man who says that his homeland is a great island in the Western Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar, which can only be Britain, and he calls it Syri. The name Syri still endures in Britain. It's Surrey, a large county on the south bank of the Thames, and London stands on most of it. You have mentions in old documents, Coradic of Lancarvan describing people in the Midlands of England and speaking of the territories of the Ealdus Essenes in 1156. The Old Syrians is pretty solid enough. So the idea that the Old Syrians came to Britain was well established and well remembered. In they were known as the Gutians, G-U-T-I-A-N-S. When Brutus came to Britain, the people who were recorded as being there were called Geontes, exactly the same name of the people who were found in the Canary Isles, Geontes. Later they became the Gewisi, and in medieval manuscripts, Anglo-Saxon chronicles and so on, they're the Gewisi. And it's fairly clear that the Gutians, the Geontes, are the Gewisi. And later they dropped the GE and called them the Wisai or Wessex people, and said, Wessex, West Saxons, isn't that beautiful? Complete misnomer and another part of the general political ploy to get rid of the history. They actually have translated the Geontes of Britain as being giants, as if there was a mythical giant race there, great big people, and another attempt to create a myth out of fact. So, having dealt with them, we then thought it wise to possibly look at the Brutus legend. Now, the Brutus legend is firmly embedded in Britain, and you have to realize that the main line of kings of Britain always claims in history descent from Brutus. And it doesn't matter if you could claim descent from the Holy Family or Jesus Christ or whatever, you have to be able to claim descent from Brutus to be king. There's no doubt about this. So Brutus had to be got rid of, on the Trojan War being a fiction and the city of Troy being a fiction. Brutus is a fiction. We decided that as the history was proving out in a number of other fields, we were getting all manner of evidence to prove it correct, and reliable history and honourable history, honestly recorded in detail, that it was worth looking at the alphabet of the people. Now, in the same way as the Greeks have an alphabet, the Arabs have an alphabet which is different, and the Egyptians had a picture alphabet, and the Chinese have a pictorial alphabet, hieroglyphics in Egypt. So we also have a peculiar alphabet peculiar to the British. You think it's peculiar to the British at first sight. Again, this alphabet has been thoroughly derided, and they have called the alphabet a forgery, a fake, and a fiction invented by a man named Edward Williams around 1800. Difficult to see that because it's in a manuscript in the Bodleian Library in Oxford which dates around 1520. Difficult to see because it also is mentioned in a book being written for and on behalf of the Prince of Wales in 1794, and the author states, this alphabet I find in a very ancient manuscript in the Bodleian Library. Equally difficult as David ap Gwilym, probably the best of the Welsh poets, is describing the alphabet in his poems in 1370. Another poet, Ieuan D, is describing the alphabet in 1425 roughly. And a further poet is describing the alphabet, Gutter Glyn, in roughly 1450. Equally, it's well known that the alphabet was brought back into use to send messages on sticks around 1400 when Owain Glyndŵr, the Welsh prince, was fighting Henry IV of England. It goes on and on. There is a satirical poem in existence written by a man named Rhys Cain. And Rhys Cain was from Oswestry, and he went to an Eisteddfod in 1580, met a Welsh bard from Glamorgan who had a pipe in it. In other words, a frame of wood with wooden slats in it, upon which was cut with a knife the straight strokes of the Coelbren alphabet and a story. And Rhys Cain kindly wrote a satirical mocking poem about the alphabet. Fine. We also find that in 1946 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, Chenaboscian it's called, a peasant named Muhammad Ali was looking for firewood, and he found a 5-foot clay jar, 5 foot tall, in an old cemetery. He dragged the jar out, took it home, or broke it on one thing or the other. Inside were 14 leather satchels. In the 14 leather satchels were 128 Gnostic books, a complete Gnostic library of the Gnostic Christian Church. Now, for 1500 years, people have only really known about the Gnostics, what their enemies, the Church of Rome, chose to write about them, and it's not very polite. But here was an intact Gnostic library. In amongst these 128 books is the book of Massanes, which means laid flat, raw, and a wonder. It means an alphabet, it's not a name of a person. And this gives a complete, detailed description of the Coelbren British alphabet, how it is, what it is, and how it works. Same descriptions were published roughly the same, well, almost exactly the same in 1840 in Wales. So we have signs that the alphabet would work. Now, if we look at the Brutus legend, we have this. The British finally come from Western Turkey, Troy, to Britain under Brutus. They pick up people on the way. In other words, they stop at Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, pick up more of their countrymen from Troy and proceed to Britain. So you can possibly link a common alphabet in Britain, Iberic Spain, and Troy. We also know that shortly before the British came from Troy, the Etruscans moved out. And they moved out around 650, 600 BC. And from the same area, Phrygia, in Trojan areas of Turkey. So we have another possible link between Turkey, the Etrurian Empire, which lasted 650 to 100 BC in Italy, and again in Rhytia in Italy, and again in Rhytia, which is now part of Switzerland, because Pliny the Elder kindly tells us the Rhytians were Etruscans. What we did then was to identify that the alphabets in all these areas anciently were very similar. You could say near identical. We were encouraged to do this because a man named John Williams in 1846 wrote a book, and in his book he exhibited the ancient Coelbren British alphabet, and in exhibiting it he gave the cipher. In other words, what's an A, what's a B, what's a C. And he also said, isn't it strange that the British alphabet is almost identical with Etruscan and with Pelasgian on the coast of Turkey? Well, it's not strange at all if that's where we ancestrally come from, and if that's where the Etruscans come from, and we are roughly kinsmen. There is a tie-up in that Llewellyn Sion of Glamorgan in 1560 preserved the alphabet and preserved its cipher. In other words, he wrote down which sign is A, which is B, which is C, which is D, right through. He also wrote down which signs were numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so we have an alphabet and we know the lettering. If we know the lettering, obviously if we see a series of signs, we put the appropriate letters underneath, out will pop a word. That word will be in Cymric, in Welsh, and we should be able to translate it into English or French or German or any other language for people to read. If we look at the name of the people, it becomes more interesting. The proper name of the people you would know as Welsh is Cymru. In the modern 20th century, it's popular to use the word C, but the correct spelling is Khumry. In ancient Turkey, they were known by the Greeks as the Kimmeroi, Cimmeroi, right? They were known by Herodotus, writing in around 460 BC, as the Cimmerians. They moved out of Iraq and Iran, northern areas, out of Assyria, I think when Sennacherib was murdered by one of his sons, and civil war erupted in the Assyrian Empire. The records of the Assyrian emperors dug up at Nineveh and taken to the British Museum, 25,000 clay tablets, exhibit these very same people as the Cymry, Khumry, exactly the spelling and name that they have in Britain. The Assyrian emperors got these people from a place we would know as Israel, and they would appear to be the 10 tribes. So there is a clear linkage of people right the way back. We decided that we would attempt to translate the ancient stones in Britain, which are known to be of the year 200 AD in one instance. Those in Aberdeen and Angus in Scotland are known to be 6th century. There are stones in Galloway, said to be 6th century. There are stones in Cumbria, northwest England, again of the same era. There's stones dug up in St Paul's Churchyard in London, known to the Dark Age. And there are a number of stones in Wales and a number of church fonts. One of them is an ancient oak font. it's made from the stump of an oak tree, carved into a font, and an inscription round the thing. It actually names Arthfail, who is the Welsh spelling of Arthur. Very interesting. So we've got a number of stones all over the place. We simply applied the alphabet to these stones. In other words, that sign is A, that's B, that's C, or whatever. We then had, under the list of signs, we had a list of modern letters. Those modern letters formed words, and we were able to read what the stones say. So a stone put up in Nevin in West Wales around 950 turns out to be inscribed with the name of Higuel Rex, and in all the manuscripts Higuel Rex is Howell the Good, who ruled the area and died in 948, and if the stone's put up around 950, that's right. The ruins of his court under Upper Court Farm and Lower Court Farm are about 6 to 8 miles away, and about, I think, 6 miles away is Crug Howell, the heap of Howell, his grave mound. So he fits. We found another stone in Wales, interesting one. It said Godufan the Exile. Godufan is a bit of a mouthful of a name, hardly inventable. And we find around 200 AD, a British king named Godufan was indeed deposed. It says in the records, Godufan was a turbulent, mad and wild king, for which reason he was deposed, exiled, and his brother Hrun placed in his stead. And it goes on right through Britain. You can translate all the stones with correct meaning, and naming people and giving a little more historical detail elsewhere. This encouraged us to tackle Etruscan inscriptions. So we looked for Etruscan inscriptions. Now you'll find in Britain a lot of books, not many about Etruria. It's not popular in Britain, presumably it's considered to be Italian. So whilst the Romans are much publicised, the Italians aren't, or the Etruscans aren't. And we found great volumes of Etruscan pictures of statues and ruined buildings and tomb mounds, but it was very hard to get at inscriptions. When we started to get to them, we found that they were little ones on wine bottles, on bronze mirrors, which were carved with scenes, with statements, on the sides of statues, all sorts of minor artifacts that people would use would have inscriptions on them. We were able to translate these without any difficulty whatsoever. And what we did note, and it's unmistakable, that some of these, particularly on, say, wine bottles, are pithy little humorous statements. And they unmistakably have the dry humour and the dry sort of self-depreciating wit that we associate with Jewish people. There's no doubt about this. And we therefore went further. We looked at, there's one very famous inscription. They found a tomb of a princess or great noble lady in one of the Etruscan cemeteries, untouched, and they found within this tomb a large amount of silver tableware. It's virtually an ancient tea set or dining set in silver. And this has been translated, if you can use the word translated, to mean Lathia. And they then said, aha, Lathia is the woman who owns this stuff. You see? And they even gave it a second name. And what they're doing is taking the Etruscan letter, finding the nearest Greek letter that matches it, and then reading it in Latin. Although Pliny and a number of other writers tell them time and time and time again that the Etruscan language is nothing whatsoever remotely like Latin or Greek. And although they're told this, they can't resist doing something about it. In other words, the academic can never say, I don't know. And he feels he's writing to an uninformed audience who don't know either, and he can get away with it. So we translated this Lathia stuff. It was very interesting because it actually says the gift to lie silent in the tomb, and words to that effect. And it doesn't say Lathia at all. And realizing we were onto a winner, we translated a lot of the major Etruscan texts. We translated the Perugia Keepus, a large stone slab with like a great gravestone with 36 lines of detailed writing on it, and it tells how 12 clan or tribal units of a people are setting up a union, and in this unified state they will divide the land equally amongst themselves. They will cooperate to drain the land, to irrigate it, to fertilize it, to clear the swamps, the woods, and to make it productive, and they will not war with each other, they will attempt to cooperate. It's, I don't know, like a constitution in a sense. We then translated other major statements. We found the 3 gold tablets that were known as the Purgy tablets from a temple at the port of Coelbren. That's the Welsh way of pronouncing it. It was the ancient Etruscan port near Rome, major city area with 3 ports. And these little gold tablets, one's in Carthaginian and 2 are in Etruscan. They've not been read. We're able to find that they tell of the league of the Etruscans and Carthaginians to provide 60 warships each to combined fleet to attack the Greek. Provide 60 warships each to combined fleet to attack the Greek Phocaean pirates who'd settled on the Isle of Sardinia and to get rid of them. The Greeks had been driven out or opted out from Turkey on the shores of there, and they'd come away when Cyrus had become Emperor of Persia, sent his general Harpagus there. And they had decided to set up in Sardinia and to make a living robbing the merchant fleets of the Carthaginians and the Etruscans. And it's well known that this league was formed. The whole story is well recorded by ancient authors. And here we have it repeated on the Purgy tablets. So we know that we're into authentic history. The other major text we deciphered in Etruria was the Agnone tablet in the British Museum, a large bronze tablet, 26 lines of writing on one side, a lesser amount on the other side. And it tells who the Etruscans were and where they came from before they got to Etruria. And I think, therefore, it's a very important tablet. It says that they were in a country happily. There was huge pestilence and plague and all sorts of cosmic disasters. They were led out of this country and they went with the little cabinet in a cart, and they follow this little cabinet which is in a cart. And they finally arrive at another land which is their own land, and it's given to them, and they settle there and live there. I'm obviously paraphrasing what it says. And later on the other side it says how they are forcibly removed and ejected from this land of their own, and they are taken to another place which they don't like. And again they follow the little cabinet in the cart, and the little cart was presumably drawn by oxen or donkeys or something. And off goes the little cart and they follow it. And they come to a place and they take ship, and in ships they come to Etruria. It appears the Cymry are moving off from northern Assyria through Asia Minor, coming to the Dardanelles. They take ship and they go round to Etruria. That's what it appears to be telling us. And obviously the earlier side, the other side, would appear to be that they're in Egypt, and there's the cataclysms in Egypt at the time of Moses. They're led out by Moses. They follow the little ark in the cabinet, whatever it is in the cart, and they go to their own land, their promised land. So I think it's probably one of the most important documents we've read so far. Now, having got that far, we then said, well, what have they got in Phrygian, areas in Turkey? And we found one very long inscription straight away, much publicized, and it's over the top of a building, which looks like a temple to us, and it is described actually as the tomb of Midas. And when we looked at this long inscription, runs right over the top and right down the side, it reads out perfectly into Cymric again. And there's no doubt whatsoever about it. Now, whether the inscription was added to an existing temple building, or whether it was put up by the builders of the building, is another matter. There's no doubt whatsoever it's a form of harp's prayer. And it's very unlikely that that's a tomb. It's probably a temple building. So we were now in a position of translating all the ancient British stones. We were in a position of translating any Etruscan inscription we come across or we wish to translate and getting sense. We turned to Rhaetia, where certain small inscriptions have been preserved, and we mopped them up in no time. They also translate into Cymric, and we know from Pliny that the Rhaetians in Switzerland are Etruscans who moved north. So we've got a constant fit in the same way as there was devastation in the world tomorrow, and New Zealand was the only place that escaped. It's quite possible that in later years New Zealanders would drift into ravaged America and would find documents that they could read in their own language, their own tongue, and the same in Canada, and they'd finally work their way back to the UK and read what was left there. And this is all we're doing. We're doing what Alex Haley did in a much more we're not quite in the family genre that he's in. We're into a national sort of situation, but we're following our national roots right the way back as far as we can. Interestingly, the Welsh have always said that their language is the language of the angels, and the language and alphabet is the language of heaven. Now, they say that in those words. And here we have it called the language of the angels and the language of heaven in the Nag Hammadi scrolls in the Gnostic library. That's precisely the same definition they give of the same alphabet. It's the language of God, it's the language of heaven. So we had now accomplished that which pleased us, because really we were verifying the basic and fundamental accuracy of British history as we know it, and as it has been flung aside and derided. You've got to realise that the average Englishman has been persuaded that he's an Anglo-Saxon, and therefore anything before 500 AD doesn't apply to him and is to be booted out and got rid, in the same way as the Americans came here and got rid of the Indian culture and history. But the thing is, you'd think that they'd have learned something. Over there, they've been there longer. Actually, very few English people are Angles or Saxons, and the phrases that I hear used, like an Anglo-American agreement, are just absurd. It's like saying a British Minnesota agreement for the USA. Very few people in Britain are Angles. What you're saying is you've got an agreement with the county of Northumberland. It's a complete absurd piece of nomenclature. Tiny numbers of them were Saxons on the coasts of Kent and around Sussex and Dorset and around there, the Isle of Wight. And certainly the bulk of the population is ancient Gutian, it's Vandal Mercian, it's British, it's picked in the British from the Brutus people of Troy, the Trojans, the Cymry, and from the Syrians. And the idea that they're Angles and Saxons is just the daftest thing you'll ever hear. But they've been persuaded that they are. And the strange thing is this: the Welsh, in the persons of the Cymry, attacked northern France, as is well known. They attacked Europe, the British, in 383. And the two major principalities that endured were Brittany, which still does, and Llydaw. Llydaw became Normandy in 852, when the Normans were aided by the French king to attack the place and install Roland and Ortaganger. But a Welshman can go over and speak Welsh to Bretons today, and in a very short time they're understanding each other. And a Breton can come to Wales and he can speak to the Welsh and understand each other. But it's very strange that no Angle and no Saxon, as we call them, no Englishman can go to Germany and speak to Germans, and they never could. So there's got to be something wrong. Now, Welsh records of 826 say very clearly that the language which prevailed in England and became the national language is the language of the Isinglas. It's the language of the Iceni. The Iceni are the great big tribe who were led by a tribal nation led by Boudicca in her attack upon the Romans in the time of Nero. So this is the language of England, not Angle and not Saxon. And then you've got a question: is it Angle or is it Saxon? You can't have Anglo-Saxon. It's like saying we've got French Yugoslavian. What is it? And it's neither. So we have a number of fictions in this wonderful home of tradition in England. Interesting situation. Can we stop there for a minute? Have a cup of coffee?
God's earth.
Blackett can do it.
You're wonderful.
Blackett does it. He's not as erudite as I am, but his mind is...
Really?
Would have made a good professor.
Would you like some coffee?
No,
Or
I'm fine.
Are you okay?
But since we can, I don't want to.
I'll tell you, Alan, we were doing some decent PR stuff with you here because it looks like you're in a very comfortable home situation. I backed off a couple times, got the fireplace.
Oh, yeah.
It's like,
This guy's knows what he's well off.
It's called Fireside Chat.
Yeah.
FDRs.
And I don't believe it.
For what grade?
He retired from work at the age of 19. He had a job, but he packed the job in and said that he wished to go on Social Security in order to look after his father. No, I looked after my parents for quite a time when they were old, and my grandmother as well. I looked after my parents for quite a time when they were old, and my grandmother as well. But I did it by going out to work and getting someone else to clean the house. Right? But he decided he would pack in. Now, the first thing Major did as a political action, he joined the Conservative Party, became very enthusiastic. And you've got to be boneheaded to do that. And he then proceeded to set himself up and got himself nominated to be a councillor in a ward. I think it's Wandsworth. But in that area, you have to live in the ward in order to stand as councillor. And so he produced a form, signed it, and gave his address, which was within the ward, and he somehow got himself elected. It's subsequently been found that this house that he said he lived in is still lived in by the same resident for the last 50-odd years. Certainly before, she's a woman in her 80s, well before Major was born. And they've been to her on TV and said, did he ever live here? And she says, no. Do you know him? No. When they showed him a photograph, she said, I've never seen him in my life, and he's the Prime Minister. You see? And so his first political action was a forgery. Now, he could be taken to court for that and prosecuted. And if I make money out of this and become a millionaire, I'm going to do it. No, because it's time somebody taught politicians in Britain that they are bound by the law, like anybody else. It's time somebody straightened them up. So when you talk to me about John Major, I don't want to know. You know, if ever a man shouldn't be, it's him. He's a complete lying fraud. And I don't think he's going to do any good for Britain. I think he's worse than Thatcher, and that's a little bit like saying, you know, worse than Genghis Khan or something, you know, from the outside. Because that woman will go down subsequently, when people come to write the histories, as the biggest disaster ever to hit the British Isles.
Can you imagine selling the water rights to a private company that jacks the price up and can charge anything they want with a monopoly, or the power company?
We, as a people, used to own the electric companies. We, as a people, used to own the gas companies and the water companies. We owned them. They belonged to the nation. And they were damn good. You know? And to sell them off privately and to allow foreign investors to buy large lumps of it is beyond belief.
To buy a monopoly, and then they can charge anything they want. The first thing, 30% jump in the cost.
Yeah. And electric prices went up 46% in 15 months. And I wonder how we can afford to live there. And the result is now, I told you when I first met you, I think, all of a sudden over there, people are now finally saying, do we need this damn monarchy? Because the attack is focusing onto something, and it's swinging around to focus on them, you see. And the ruling elite needs the monarchy. They need the puppet, the theatre, to mesmerise people with this. I mean, people sell magazines over here of Fergie and Diana. And Diana's a redundant school teacher, a long, skinny, gawky piece, a nice lady, nice person. There's no doubt about that, but you pass her in the street. The other one's a fat little dumpy person with apparently no personality, no manners, and so on. And she's the horse trainer's daughter. So one's a redundant school teacher and the other's a horse trainer's daughter. And this family is covering themselves with, I mean, the Queen's sister, Margaret, ran around with Bodley Llewellyn for about 12 years in front of her husband, a man 10 years her junior. And finally there was the inevitable divorce. It should have happened earlier. Charles' sister, the Queen's daughter, Anne, had the same sort of performance with her husband, and finally there's a divorce there. Charles Windsor, his marriage with this Diana is obviously, it's on the rocks whether you like it or not. And he doesn't know how to behave himself. His younger brothers had a disaster with this silly woman that he married, this Fergie they call her, and her lecherous father, who was no credit to anybody, and is whitewashed in films over here, you know, but was photographed in and out of all the massage parlours and brothels of London. And the whole gang of them, Mountbatten, who got himself blown up, had the largest collection of pornography that you could imagine, was a complete weirdo. This is not generally known, you know. It was a professional collection of pornographic material. The whole lot of them are in disarray, aren't they? And now you've got books being published showing that George V was the second son of Edward VIII, and why didn't Edward, the eldest son of Edward VIII, become king in 1908? was it 1912 or something? And then everybody said, oh yeah, he was the eldest son, why didn't he become king? He said, what happened to him? And they had him locked away somewhere in some castle in Scotland with the Bowes-Lyon family, I told you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole thing stinks. So the present queen shouldn't be queen, and the guy living in Paris should be king. And I think they're in trouble. I think they're in desperate trouble. So I can see why anything that we say might actually shake the whole jelly-like edifice. I think so. Wouldn't be very pleasant, would it?
Not for the king.
Well, I mean, they started this battle with us, if you call it that, in that we didn't know any of this when we started up. We were just looking for King Arthur. That's all. We should look at King Arthur. You know? And they could have played it a different way and styled it a different way. Anyway, enough of them. But Major,
Okay, if we want to do something for Diane Sawyer, what did you have in mind exactly? Do you know anything you know exactly?
what does she want? What does she want to know? What's she going to do her program on?
I
What is
think
she gonna do?
inscriptions, I think that's the important part, the alphabet. And I think that the statement that we need from Alan is that there is an alphabet, that this alphabet appears to have been that alphabet of the Welsh-speaking Indians, which was well documented. An alphabet that was discovered and identified by Schoolcroft, who later became ethnology director. They knew it was British. They knew that it was had at least 14 Old British characters and maybe 12 characters that were Iberian. That should have told him right there, but he didn't write to anybody. He simply he didn't write to the Welsh. He wrote to Copenhagen, and he wrote to France. They identified it as an alphabet, and he wrote to several places in the Mediterranean and Europe. And then, unfortunately, they got him so confused that it was totally thrown out in history. But that alphabet and that inscription was there in 1840s, found in 1828. In 89 was when we identified the fact that this alphabet was an alphabet of the Brits, and that it was the alphabet used by the Welsh-speaking Indians. And then Alan comes into the picture because he starts translating the inscriptions that we have, and we have now over 40 inscriptions on this continent using this same alphabet. And Alan is tied. Tell him about that, Alan. You're tied to an alphabet and to a language, and you can't.
Well, what we've got is an impeccably authentic alphabet, which I've demonstrated amply elsewhere. It traces back 2,000, 3,000 years into the Middle East. The sources of proof are multiple, in other words, hundreds. We know that we knew by 83 these people had come to America. So we weren't surprised to find the alphabet here. It translates perfectly in that there are stones in America which have the alphabet upon them. We apply the cipher to it, which we have. We know which letter of the alphabet applies to which sign. We get coherent, legible, sensible results. So we know that these people, whoever they were using A, the Old British alphabet, and B, it's in the Cymric language. They were speaking Cymric Welsh. And that much we know immediately. That can tie then directly into manuscript sources of well authenticated, very detailed, multiple sources of British history of voyages here. And that's where we stand at this moment of time.
I think that's what we need. That's the exact message that we need to send to Diane. I don't know if you got my portion of it or not.
Let's do it again. It's up to you.
Let me do this.
I think
And
he,
not
what you would call
able to
struck out.
identify. Well, he certainly did, but
In Britain, we'd
Right,
say
we'd say
he made
struck out.
zero. That means a duck's egg. He made a duck. A duck's egg, zero. Zilch. They call it making a duck. And
Over
he-
here-
he struck out.
military terms is getting the Maggie's drawers.
He certainly.
You remember that.
He certainly got the zero, you know. The thing is that what I can't comprehend is who on earth appointed the Cyrus Thomases and the John Wesley Powells of the world And how on earth did these people have the arrogance to pontificate the way they did and get away with it? And what is wrong with, I thought the Americans were sort of people of get up and go, that they wouldn't stand for nonsense. And here I find them bowing down and scraping to long dead idiots, you know, instead of taking these people on and tearing them to shreds, you know. I mean, they've left you a legacy of stupidity.
Unfortunately, they just didn't have the expertise to do it back in 1840, and that's the answer.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the modern world, and this is the world of the telephone and the express letter, the airplane to go there. This is the world where you can send a book from one country to the other. You could fax it. This is the world of transfer of information, and I find no information crossing anywhere to anywhere, because they don't seem to realize they need it. You know, I said you could say various things about books, and I've been absolutely bewildered. What is not on this continent, with all your wealth and your resources, what you don't have? And I find it a matter of concern that somebody isn't saying, well, we'll get some of them all. I mean, I think with a library of, say, 12 books, I mean, you've got one book printed where people did a great service to everybody, in that they got all the ancient Welsh triads, all the music that they could gather, they got all the ancient histories, about a dozen of them, they got all the ancient Welsh poetry they could gather, hundreds of poems, and they put it in a one thick book of several thousand pages, like a vast Bible. It is the British Bible, because the Bible to me is only the Jewish history book of philosophy and history and whatever. And here is this Bible of the Brits in one book.
Yeah.
And you only need that one book, and you could conquer this situation standing on your head. And I marvel that nobody's even got a copy of that book. With a dozen books, you could do the whole thing, no problem.
Well, it's made a real dilemma to the academicians on this continent, because on every continent in the world, these inscriptions are an important part of archaeological evidence. But on this continent, because the mindset is such that there was no inscriptions, and they simply threw out Schoolcroft's work and others, therefore it didn't exist, and they went right on with their setting up of the historical records in which no one came before Columbus. Now, whether that was politically motivated because we didn't want to deal with these people living here, the Indians, the Melungeons, the Native Americans, whether or not that was the political don't know, don't care. The important thing is that this inscription was there, the mass evidence of historic manuscripts documenting this event, now that we can tag right to it, is all in place, and yes, it is diffusional. Yes, it is a migration of people that may have come and gone back, some. But the importance is that it's been left out of our history books, and it's been left off of our historical markers, and we are bulldozing this evidence daily into obscurity, and that's got to stop. Not only this evidence, but the other evidence that's here, and some of it is still, thank God, in our museums.
Well, you know, if you, in defense of Schoolcraft, right?
Yeah.
And others,
Sure.
If they went to Britain for evidence, they would have been confronted with the most jingoistic, and that means extreme nationalist, bunch of idiots that you'd ever meet on planet Earth.
Well, they've gone to England, you mean?
And yeah, they'd have gone into London, and they'd have gone to the great universities of London, Oxford, and Cambridge, and they'd have been confronted with people who were patently dishonest. You've only got to read a history of Britain written by an Oxford professor of 1864, which I've got, and it's absolutely rabid nationalism, you know, England, and really the United Kingdom is really England uber alles. The others are appendages, and, you know, that they cling on to. And there was a great need psychologically with their great empire ideas, and the empire was going to last 1,000 years, like Adolf Hitler's Reich. And they saw themselves as a sort of third empire, Greece, the great cultural empire they imagined, and then Rome, the great cultural and political trading empire, and now they were the great empire of the world. They envisaged themselves in this light. So they taught their children ancient Greek history and ancient Roman history in preference to ancient British history, which as Anglo-Saxons they felt was not part of them because it came from Germany. They had Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha married to Victoria, both Germans who run the throne, very unpopular when they started out. They had a German monarchy, which for over 300 years no British person married into, right? And you have a situation where people were very anxious to destroy and tear down what they saw as the fringe histories of Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And the Welsh were probably the biggest menace to this psychological sort of ascendancy that they wanted. And so if Schoolcraft arrived there, he'd have been told, all British history is rubbish. Troy does not exist. British history is founded on Troy. It's all a big lie. And you read phrases like a barbarous, ignorant nation which, seeking an ancient sort of heritage, decided they would adopt Troy and the Trojans and falsely did this. And I've got books saying this. Then, of course, Heinrich Schliemann comes along in 1873. Of course, Heinrich Schliemann doesn't know that the English have officially declared Troy to be a fiction. And in his ignorance, he transgresses and he digs up Troy. And that's why you'll still find English scholars in London and Oxford, Cambridge and elsewhere are very nervous about Troy. Because if Troy is not a fiction, then British history is not a fiction. And if British history is not a fiction, you have the English in the role of the Romans. You know, you create a desert and you call it civilization. And therefore, they are very much in the dock. They're on trial. And even today you'll find English people are very anxious to write books saying, you know, did Troy really exist? Because they're still nervous about this genocide that they attempted. You know, and it is a genocide, and they were at it for 700 years, desperately trying to kill off the Gaelic in Scotland and Ireland, desperately passing law after law, iniquitous legislation, to deliberately kill off the Cymric language in Wales, to eliminate it, because they felt this was the way to make everybody good little Englishmen.
So basically, we're saying...
Schoolcraft would have been misled by these people. They would have said, oh, it didn't exist, and therefore, as British history's fiction, this alphabet, described by Caesar and Strabo and Ammianus Marcellinus and on coins and on stones, is also a fiction. And they would have led him right up the garden path.
Throw it out.
I think Dr. Goebbels must have studied at Oxford or Cambridge. yeah, he'd fit in very well.
So now that they found Troy, all you're asking is, give us back our history.
Yeah, we'd like our history back, please, if you...
Thank you very much.
Don't mind.
And what we're saying on this continent is, give us back our history. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And it's the same history. And there are 12,000 descendants on this continent.
No, there are 12 million.
12 million Welsh descendants on this continent. And only 4 living there.
Yeah, but you've also got people from what's called Anglo-Saxon, but of Icenic background, writing the Iceni language on this continent. Because there are 3 inscriptions very clearly in Icenic on this continent again, and of antiquity. So you probably had a few Irish people and came along for the ride as well. I would think so. Be surprised if they didn't.
And snake worshippers.
Well, so really, Schoolcraft was in a no-win situation, because he was entering a country which was on a nationalistic high, and this was the not in the same vicious way, but in a different way, but a political Third Reich situation in 1850 in the UK. And they were beating the drum, their wonderful achievements. They suddenly had railway engines that would run anywhere, you know, and move anything, huge loads and people. They now didn't rely on the wind. They had steamships and sailed the oceans. They were making ships out of iron, whereas for 3,000 years they'd been made out of wood. They thought ruling most of the world, India and lumps of Africa and God knows where. And so they were on a sort of mental high. And therefore it was inconceivable that their ancestry should not be superior to that of others. And this was the mental situation, the froth into which Schoolcraft would have entered. And they'd have sent him in ever decreasing circles.
Well, he certainly did. It got him confused well, in spite of the fact that on that stone there's a big British cross on the bottom. He ignored that. And yet it shouted out to him that these people were in fact Christians.
So, what do you do? We're not up against a situation of, what do we say? If this were put into a court of law with a prosecution and a defense, right? before the jury, we'd win easily. There's no question at all about that. The facts and the evidence come down irrevocably in favour of this alphabet, its integrity, its authenticity and its accuracy, and also in favour of the accuracy of the histories we're discussing. But the trouble is to get it into open discussion, into the open public forum. Because, you see, apart from anything else, people in universities have only one thing generally, and that's their reputation. And the reputation is the most fragile entity on the face of planet Earth. And if they have nailed their flags too firmly to the wrong mast, then they perceive they're in definitely desperate trouble. And so we are up against a situation where I think the main problem we face is actually getting the evidence into the open and getting the evidence displayed, explained, and publicly examined and discussed.
I think it should be.
And but that's your problem.
That's the problem.
Because a man who knows that he's going to lose will go to court and say to the judge, Your Honour, please do not allow this evidence into court. It is inadmissible evidence. Now, in court in America today, I've seen some films, and they say, you can't allow this evidence into court. They didn't have a search warrant when they found this, so
That's
this
right.
murderer is not a murderer. You see? Because the guy who found the gun didn't have a warrant to find the gun. Now, what they're saying is exactly the same thing. They're saying, aha, that evidence was not found by a university archaeologist. Therefore, it is inadmissible. But if you think, how many archaeologists are there in universities? Very, very few. So the majority of them do not spend their time tramping the hills and woods. They're mainly in big cities and sitting down lecturing and telling students a pack of nonsense, right? And therefore, the chances of archaeologists finding something is actually remote. Most things that are found in Britain are found by workmen digging a trench. They're digging a sewer. They find the palace of King Cogidubnus, which has been lost for 1800 years. You know, and they find a Roman villa when somebody wanted to build a barn in Gwent. And when he wanted to build his barn, they found a Roman villa. Then they found a whole Roman town along the river. Then they found a whole Roman cemetery with stone sarcophaguses because somebody wanted to build a barn. So archaeologists don't actually go out and find things.
But that isn't necessarily the case, because those government employees at Loudoun County were working and took the material straight to the Smithsonian. That is on record. They were pre-archaeologists, but they were trained to do what they did.
But the stance is, Your Honour, this evidence is inadmissible because it proves us wrong and loses our case. That's the nub of it.
Isn't that the truth?
And yet, therefore, you could say in this case, nearly everything in the world is inadmissible. Arab youths found the Dead Sea Scrolls, not an archaeologist. An Arab goat herd found the cache of the pharaohs in Egypt, at Del al-Abir. And he found 36 pharaohs in a cave. An archaeologist didn't find them.
Of course not.
And then they found another cache of over 140 minor royal bodies. Again, Arabs found it. And you'll find almost anything and everything that has actually been found, very little of it has been as a result of scientific examination of the histories in order to see if the histories are correct. It's almost always a chance find. The boats found at Chepstow in Wales 2 years ago on the river. Somebody is digging on the riverbank where there was an ancient port recorded. The archaeologists and historians have ignored it totally. Nobody's ever gone along and said, let's have a trial, see if it's a boat here. Somebody, nothing to do with the colleges, finds timber. He recognises it may be old. He reports it. Result, 26-foot boat, 1,500 years old. Not found by the archaeologists. Because the chances of them doing it, if you think of it, unless they study the history and say, by analysis, this site should yield something.
Yes.
But their chances, everything is accidental.
They don't use the historical records.
They don't.
But you also have a different mindset over there, because within 2 hours there was an archaeologist on hand. Within 24 hours you had 50,000 pounds, $80,000. And in 6 months?
6 weeks.
6 weeks?
$500,000.
$500,000.
And they got both of
And
them.
they got it.
But the point is, what they're trying to say, as I perceive it here, is if it is not actually found by an archaeologist, in other words, a man goes out hunting, stumbles on something in the woods, a sculpted head, right?
Right.
That is now contaminated evidence because he's not an archaeologist. Another guy goes somewhere, finds something in a cave. Pity he did that. It's now contaminated. It's not archaeological evidence. You know, this is an imbecile attitude. The idea is that 250 million Americans are a bunch of liars, and only about 1,000 people are to be trusted. And they're the archaeologists. And most of them are interested in Egypt and Greece and elsewhere. And it brings you down to about 20 people at the end of the day in colleges who are saying only we are to be trusted to find anything, and we're not going to bother. And if you find something, we're going to ignore it because it's contaminated because you found it, not me. Can't be true because I didn't think of it.
And they certainly are ignoring our historians that say it must be true because it's here in the history.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is give us back our history. That's what he's saying.
Yeah, there is something seriously wrong. It's unbelievably wrong. And I think Schoolcraft would have been misled in England, definitely. And nobody in England would bother to go 150 miles to the Welsh border to find out. And if he did, he would energetically conceal that which he discovered.
But there was a university in 1840, certainly set up in Wales. It was probably bigger than Oxford.
No, there were the beginnings of a university in Aberystwyth.
See.
It has now grown. I think the University of Wales has 18,000 students. There's 12,000 in Cardiff. So the University of Wales has grown, but the Welsh universities in antiquity did exist in the Dark Ages.
Oh, yeah.
And 3 Welsh scholars were taken to found Oxford University for Alfred the Great, I think in the year 900. So he had to get them from Wales too, because nobody in England could read and write at the time. And that's recorded by Alfred. So you begin there. But certainly we had universities until about, say, 1100, and they were destroyed by the persistent attacks. The first attack of they were destroyed by the persistent attacks. The first attack of the English in Wales was always at the churches and the universities. When the Welsh invaded parts of England, certainly about the year 1200 or so, some of the soldiers asked their leader if they should have, loot the churches, and he said no. He said the English anger God by attacking churches. We won't do it. And so there was a different attitude. You've got Offa of Mercia attacking churches in Wales in 826, presumably because he thought there'd be something there. And you have Edgar of the English attacking the monasteries and churches, again for loot, in 1050. And then having fits of remorse and sending bells back to Welsh churches that he'd looted because he thought God wouldn't like it and he might not get through the pearly gates. So you've got a slightly different attitude, but certainly there were, in antiquity, Caesar recalls the British universities. Again. But by 1100 they'd managed to destroy just about everything. So he would have found plenty of schools and minor colleges in Wales. There were minor institutions.
We had we listened to a presenter in Columbus, Georgia talk about the 2 serpent mounds in Kentucky, 4 in Ohio, 2 in West Virginia, and he said that only place in the world that those serpent mounds existed was on this continent, and you said that's not so.
Well, you know that St. Patrick is a Glamorgan man from South Wales.
Sure.
He's born in Tyrone, which is about 3 Ashries. It's about 12 miles from Cardiff, still there. He went to the college at Kiowagan, which later became Llanelli Bow. So they had a university college there in 430. And they were teaching Greek and Latin and mathematics and astrology and astronomy and all these things. Patrick, that's on the Glamorgan coast, no we measure. Patrick went over to Ireland in apparently 434, and his target was to throw the snakes out of Ireland. And as you know, you can go to Ireland and there's plenty of grass snakes there. I don't think they have any poisonous snakes, like you get the adder and the viper in Britain. And the snakes he was throwing out are actually stone snakes. The great stone curved snakes, snake worshippers. Because the record is that he went to the circle, which would be the egg in the mouth of the snake.
Sure.
I think the snake is a great comet swallowing the sun, you see, blotting it out, obliterating it,
Interesting.
And he lit his fire in the center of the circle in the snake's mouth, which is a ritual fire. So he lit a druidic fire.
Right.
Because you realize early Christianity in Britain, particularly in Wales, was a welded Christianity, druidic religion. It was a melding together of the two. And by lighting his fire in the circle in the mouth of the snake, he desecrated it as far as the snake worshippers were concerned. They arrived to do their big ceremony, and oh dear, he's desecrated the sites. And he went as a target to the king and others, and his target really was the court to convert the nobility.
Well, are there other references to stone snakes being disassembled?
Oh yeah, they were still dozens of references in the lives of the saints, particularly in Brittany, of people going and ridding the area of great serpents that were a nuisance to the parish or community, and tearing the stones down. So, and you've got references to people ridding an area of great worms, as they call these great serpents in the ground, as late as 1350, 1400 in England. It clung on in northern England. And I think the situation you've got is that the local lord is sitting there quite happily running the area, and every once or twice a week or a month, the local priest banging on his door and saying, look, you've got to do something about this lot, And they're coming to church Sunday, or some of them are coming, but every Friday night they're up on the hill there, lighting fires, and, I want this sorted. And finally Sir Humphrey or whatever says, oh dear, gets his men, and off they go, and they tear the serpent apart, the serpent mound. And he's then recorded as slaying the dragon, the great worm. And in some cases, these people lie on the effigies lie on their table tombs with, pull their effigy and their sword, and they're the dragon slayers. But actually, what they've done is to tear apart a serpent mound. But certainly, the serpents that Patrick threw out of Ireland were not the grass snakes, which are still there, but were the stone serpents.
The snake certainly goes back in mythological and religious antiquity to how far back, you say? Does it go back?
Well, the Greeks represented Zeus as a gigantic serpent. The Maccabean kings of Judea, Galilean family, Judas Maccabeus and his sons, the Hasmonean kings in on. They made coins, and on all their coins they show Jehovah, Yahweh, as a human serpent with serpent legs and serpent appendages, and he is described as the great serpent. And if you get into the Nag Hammadi, Gnostic Christianity, Chaldean documents again, Yahweh is the great serpent.
The great serpent. So it would be very plausible then for the snake to be in Britain with these people who came from this area in a great migration there, and then later came on a great migration to our continent. Well, one of the things that we have in Kentucky is a thing called a dulcimer, which is a harp that kind of like a guitar that we strum and lays on the lap. Did you have any of those in Britain?
There is a record of Welsh instruments, and one of them is called a crwyth, C-R-W-Y-T-H, and it's a box-like guitar that you're describing, and it's obviously a cousin to, or even closer relative, perhaps a brother or sister to your dulcimer, and may of course be the same instrument or derived therefrom. I think it would have been similar to an ancient lyre in some ways, but certainly they had an instrument of that sort. Yeah.
And of course, the harp goes way back to the Chaldean people because
well, it's the major
Sir
Welsh.
Leonard
It's
Woolley.
not generally realised. Anybody sees a harp, they normally say, "Oh, Ireland," but actually, the major Welsh instruments
was a harp.
Yeah. So
Well,
one.
we found we didn't, but in 1799, soldiers found a harp and a mermaid on armor plating at the falls of the Ohio in shallow. But they had some letters on it they thought were Latin. May have been this Coelbren, but you don't think that's a mermaid?
No, it wouldn't be a mermaid. It would be, again, Yahweh, the
Yahweh.
God. E-A becomes Yah, becomes Jah, becomes Yahweh, becomes Jehovah. And again, it would be the Yahweh figure, the great serpent, with a man's upper body and hair on his head, and the either serpent-like, eel-like.
This certainly got into the early tribes then.
And the harp with it would have been the Welsh instrument of.
Brought right to them.
Again, the harp appears to be their earliest and best-loved instrument.
There's a very strong myth among the Native Americans about a white buffalo and its sacredness. And did the ancient Chaldeans or the ancient Brits have such a type of myth of white?
Well, people have researched the sort of bull mythologies back to the first and second dynasties in Egypt, where rows of bulls' heads made of clay with the actual horns of animals appear around the facades of the supposed tombs of the first and second dynasty and so on. And in Egypt you've got 4 bull cults. I think it's the Busiris bull and the Apis bull and 2 others. And again, these appear to have been generally white, in one case white bulls, and you've got the white bull on the Cretan frescoes in Crete, in minor culture. And the bull cults go back again to ancient Assyria and beyond Assyria to Chaldea and so on. So the bull cults went all over the ancient world. It lasted as long as Mithras and the Mithras cult, which was very popular. A competitive religion with Christianity, you could say. And in Britain they had the one surviving relic is that you get mentions of people sleeping on ancient yellowed oxides and having dreams. So it's a big white bull skin, I would think. You get mentions of people sleeping on ancient yellowed oxides and having dreams. So it's a big white bull skin, I would think. Sleeping, and this is very ancient.
Are those around today?
Well, the point is that in roughly 1070, when William the Conqueror had seized most of England and was moving north, Tancred, Tankerville, I think it's either Tancred, no, I think it's Tankerville, the Earl of Tankerville, one of his men, up in the Northumberland region near Durham, I think deliberately rather than accidentally, enclosed a large area with a 9-foot stone wall.
9 foot.
9 feet. And this vast area of polished and grazing land enclosed the sacred herd of the British white cattle of the Druids, who were still going strong in West Wales and parts of Scotland. And this white herd is known as the Chillingham herd. And that herd has remained behind those walls since about 1070, that's 920 years ago. And the descendants of the herd are still there.
Can anybody go see them?
You can go see them. You have to walk through a little stream and wash your feet before you go in. It's not much advertised. You have to go with a ranger and keep away from them. Nobody has ever laid human hand on them for 900 years. No vet is ever called to treat them. If they are sick, they're sick. They die, they die. If the winters are bad, then the winters are bad. They have to put up with it. No feed is ever put down for them. Nothing is ever taken into the park in the form of animal feed. Nothing is taken out. No fertilizer is ever put down. Nothing is ever sprayed there. In other words, that herd has to survive as is, untouched by human hand, and still does, and it's still there.
Beautiful.
And they're wild cattle. You can see they're quite different from the thing you're going to meet in the farmer's field. So the Druid herd does still exist in Britain. It's called the Chillingham herd. Wonderful cattle.
Yeah. And I'm sure that they had mythological importance, religious importance to the Druids.
Well, they must have had it. And you've got to realise that Christianity wasn't like 19th and 20th century Christianity in the time of William the Conqueror.
That's right.
There were all sorts of superstitions and so on. And you had Welsh Gnostic or British Gnostic Christianity still standing firm against Roman Catholicism, which was spreading like a virus across Europe. And you had the contentions that went on into the reign of King John and beyond, with John marrying a Gnostic Christian princess in Wales, the Pope saying it's an illegitimate marriage, enraging the Prince of North Wales, who then marries the son of John and the Queen of Lady of Glamorgan in South Wales, and Joanna is the daughter of John, marries Llewellyn the Great, and all this is illegitimate. You've got Henry the First having a marriage affair with Nest in South Wales, and the result is a great man known as Robert the Consul, who was really the half-brother of Matilda, the Queen of England. And again, he's supposed to be illegitimate because he's Gnostic, not Catholic. See, if you're not a Catholic marriage, you're illegit, was the idea.
Well, this Gnostic Christianity reached Britain in 36 AD. Then certainly would have been well established in place at the Nicene Council, which was what?
Nicaea. 324, 25.
Then they would have been represented there, is that
They
right?
were. Yeah, they sent their bishops to the Council of Nicaea. But you've got to remember, Constantine the Great goes out of Britain with the British Army around 310 and starts his campaign, backed up by his mother, Helen, who is a British Christian queen. Right? And the father is Constantinus, the Emperor of the West. And you've got to remember, most of the emperors are British. And Constantine the Great, being British with his armies, wins battles. He won the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge and seized Rome and killed off his enemies, Licinius and I think it's Maximianus or whatever. Anyway, he then, having established himself as Emperor of the world, sets up his new capital in Constantinople, and he allows the Christian religion to become a legitimate religion in the empire, because he's the British king, his mother's Christian, and he's probably half Christian. Then, of course, he's bombarded with endless successions of contending bishops in the east, some from Jerusalem, some from Turkey, Anatolia, from various churches, and from North Africa and Hippo and these other people, and from Egypt, all with their various brands of Christianity, demanding that other brands of Christianity be snuffed out. Now, most Christianity right through Europe as accepted was not at the time Roman Christianity. All the great German and Gaulish and British people were Arian Christians. They were totally different. And so Constantine in the end said, oh, for heaven's sake, we've got to settle this. I can't be badgered all my life by these religious fanatics who were storming into this, raging about what other bishops were saying. And so he decided we should bureaucratically decide what Christianity should be and establish it and make everybody toe the line. And so you had the first sort of organization of Christianity. And they voted at some stage on whether Jesus the Nazarene was God or was not God, and he was elected God by a small majority. You know, rather like Clinton being elected president.
Well, did the Brits accept that?
No, they didn't, and they then opted out of any further councils. It's very hard to find representation. They just said, that's it, and walked out.
Well, then the Brits then continued with this Gnostic form of Christianity.
Yeah,
but
the original. They continued with the original Christianity.
They seemed to snuff it out in the Mediterranean and put them to death, or give them a choice to either.
Well, when the Roman Empire fell, I mean, the political power of Rome was shattered. It was no more. You had emergent powers in Germany and in France, particularly, and obviously in Spain. Britain was still independently strong. Didn't want to know, and the only way Rome could in any way exert influence, if it wanted to, was to do it through, they couldn't do it by force of arms, so they could do it by the blackmail of threat of religion, and saying, we've got the keys to heaven, and if you don't follow us, boy, you ain't going to be allowed in. And they did that, literally, and the threat, I know nobody's ever seen these keys. I never seen them. And that was the way it was done, was to claim primacy. But the first bishop of Rome was Linus, who is provably a son of King Caradoc of Britain. Caradoc, son of Arch. And so how Peter gets into the act is hard to see. Peter's not the head of the church. In the great councils originally held, where there's this dispute between Paul and Peter, the head of the church is James, the brother of Jesus, who sits as chairman of the council. So the idea of everything's handed to him is provable fallacy.
Well, then this Gnosticism, this church goes on.
Gnosticism means knowledge.
Knowledge, truth.
Truth.
Yeah, and it goes on for how long? When do you think it?
I don't think it ever died. I think it went underground. I think finally, I mean, the Catholic Church actually began infiltrating Britain, and certainly it infiltrated the northwest Bangor Sea around 800. Bishop Elvod was getting himself entangled with the Archbishop of Canterbury. I don't think the great Archbishopric of England at Lichfield was Catholic, and what you've got in England, you've got two coastal archbishoprics, one in the north at York, on the coast of the immigrant Angles from Germany. You've got one in the south coast, Canterbury, on the tip there, near the Channel, for the immigrant Jutes and Saxons. But the British churches, the archbishoprics, are right on the immigrant areas of the coast. The only great archbishopric in England is the one of the central area, Kingdom of Averagus, who's said to have given land to Joseph of Arimathea, St. Illid, and that was an archbishopric, but was snuffed out. And again, Welsh archbishoprics and were ignored. The idea of the Pope was that if you didn't receive a pallium from Rome, right, if we didn't set you up as an archbishopric or a bishop, you're not a bishop. Well, that's rather difficult when you get Britain is Christian in 36 AD, and it's a British emperor and king who makes Rome Christian in 325 AD, it's hard to see how a bishop of Rome could set up the church in Britain and give them the right to be bishops. The reverse is the case.
Yes.
And this is the problem. So I don't think we're anywhere near the truth.
No. But in 574,
And this is the problem. So I don't think we're anywhere near the truth.
no. But in 574, would not the king, the monarchy, been Gnostic? Very heavy.
Yeah, the people who would come to America would have been Gnostic Christians.
Very heavy into it.
You could call them the Protestants of the day.
Dr. Ray Hayes copyrighted in February of this year the fact that based on Sir Walter Raleigh's,
Because that's a tyranny. It's a monopoly. They're claiming a monopoly on God, and unless you come to us, you can't go to God. In other words, it's an absurdity. The British belief appears to have been any man can go direct to God. In other words, you speak to him through prayer or whatever, intercession. And I don't think these ideas would have prevailed. And yeah, finally you had the collapse of this in Britain with Henry VIII and the many wives, who did it almost inadvertently, but monks were running around selling holy blood, and really they were, and they had these little vials that you turned upside down and they changed colour and went red and so on, and they filled it up twice a week from goose blood or something like this, and duck's blood, and there was enough timber pieces of the Holy Cross sold as, religious amulets to make a sizable forest of several million acres, They were selling pieces of the cross everywhere. And they sold indulgences and penances and pardons. In other words, you go and commit some heinous crime, and provided you paid enough, you got a pardon, duly signed, stamped and sealed, you were pardoned.
Sure.
And you could actually buy a pardon or an indulgence to do something before you committed the crime.
oh my,
In other words, if you paid enough, you were then free to go and do it, and you had your absolution ready paid for. So the other thing was that people were threatened with millions of years in purgatory, rotting and roasting in hell. But if you paid the church enough, the priests would go on singing masses for you for so many years, which would get you out of this purgatory quicker. It's a form of blackmail.
one of the interesting things, Alan, the first time that you experienced a Native American ceremony was down in Columbus, Georgia. And they had a ring with a fire pit with logs and a cross. They had poles out to like north, south, east, and west. And then the Native Americans, all in their fancy costumes, lined up from tall to short. Give us what you felt when you saw this.
Well, they had a circle in the middle with 4 logs dividing, which I felt was the 4 quarters of earth and 4 quarters of heaven, which is a familiar motif right back to Chaldea, and familiar in the construction of the cosmos as known in Ireland, Wales, Judea, as well, ancient Sumerian lands. The second thing was the lining from, not from old to young, but from the tallest to the shortest. I thought it was the head of a comet streaking around the earth, which again is familiar in Gnostic religion and world experience.
Sure.
The 4 poles are the 4 stars, one in the belt of Orion, one in Taurus, one in Leo, and one in, I think, the Eagle. And if you draw a line from these main stars to each other, they cross and intersect at the pole star. Now, if you were to draw that line in the heavens and see that the pole star wasn't at the point of intersection, it means the Earth has shifted on its axis and we're in trouble.
Right.
Possibly through being swished by a comet. And so what they were doing was very familiar to me, I would think.
And then little Albert?
Well, little boy came out, well, there was a man first beating on the drum, and he handed over to little Albert, who was very keen to do it, and was beating on a drum and shouting in a sort of Gregorian chant, changing his tone and going through different octaves. And he was beating a drum and shouting Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. In other words, he was shouting Jehovah as they went around. And Jehovah is the great snake, the great serpent, the great comet. So he was shouting Jehovah as this great snake of people in the form of a comet with its long dwindling tail went round and round the earth.
Isn't that funny? That's
And
funny.
it was very simple to see what they're doing. And if you read the Navajo version of the cosmos and solar system as they see it in its formation, I've managed to read a version of this. It's identical to the Druidic version of the cosmos, and this can be demonstrated in Ireland, Wales, Judea, and Chaldea, and perhaps in Egypt. Continuity.
It certainly fits right in with the legends. One other thing that was found down by Cumberland River was a three-headed urn called a triune urn, or vessel. And it was in the home of John D. Clifford in 1820, referenced by Rafinesque, and drawn up by another Atwell. Caleb Atwell actually etched it. But it had three faces going different directions, and then they found a stone in the, up around the Newark. They had three faces on the same stone, and but they have existed. What do you think that is?
Well, clearly, you know as well as I, that it exists in the land of Cathedral in Cardiff.
Yes.
Again, the Catholic Church tried to get rid of all these three-faced icons. So you've got three faces on a stone, but the centre face has two eyes, and one of those eyes attaches to the outer face, and one of these eyes attaches to the other face, and there's four eyes, three faces joined together. You've been exhibiting a little chart and map where these things are found, and you find them in Britain, Spain, Etruria, Crete and Malta, and back to Turkey yourself.
Yes.
What I noticed when you exhibit these little items that are found with two or three heads joined together, you don't talk about the chevrons underneath, which are on them.
Oh, should have.
And you should have, because the chevrons are a major symbol of the Coelbren kings, the Welsh and British kings, Kings of Britain, you might say. And the chevrons, as you have said, are exhibited in Genesis with these people carrying their chevrons into battle. And yet you still have the chevrons, and you find the chevrons all over the artifacts you're finding in America. Chevrons are all over the artifacts, going from one end of the other, associated with the Godhead. Yeah. Associated with the God.
Certainly the king of Glamorgan would have been Arthur.
Yes.
And so that would be very significant if it's on this continent.
Yeah, the trouble with Arthur is, again, if you kick out all history before William the Conqueror, and now the English are having the problem of resurrecting their own Dark Age history, and they've only just started looking at church charters and cathedral charters of 700 and 800 and so on, and earlier. The problem is, when you throw out all Dark Age history, inevitably you throw out Arthur the First and Arthur the Second. So whereas in Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire and numerous other manuscripts, documents that he draws upon, you have a clear description of Arthur the First attacking the Roman Empire of the West as chief general of his father, Magnus Maximus Mascombledi. This can't be mentioned, because how can a fictional British king descended from Trojan kings attack Europe in 383? He attacks Europe, he attacks Paris, seizes the lady Saint Genevieve, and yet you've got romance legends of Arthur going into Europe and attacking big cities and seizing Guinevere, Saint Genevieve. You've got the well-known histories of Arthur fighting the Roman emperor and killing him, yet this Arthur Androgathius, the Romans called him, Arthur the First, in 383, is confronted finally by Gratian, the Roman emperor, at Soissons. The medievals called it the Battle of Sassy. According to the English, the Battle of Sassy. Soissons never occurred. According to the Romans and everybody else in the world, the Battle of Soissons did occur in 383. Gratian is defeated by Arthur, who's the general for his aging father, Magnus. Gratian flees with 300 horsemen down to Lyons. That's all he's got left, and in trouble. Arthur goes chasing after him, gets down there, and as you know, they have a little bit of a parley and a peace conference, and they decide to have a meal or a banquet together. And in the middle of the banquet, having probably had enough to eat, Arthur gets up, picks up his axe and cuts Gratian in half. And his father Magnus then becomes Emperor of the West. He's already got Britain and France. Spain goes over to him. All of North Africa and Egypt go over to him. Statues are erected. Arthur attacks through Spain, through Switzerland. There's the chapped Arthur still there, a pass at near Geneva, Saint Genevieve, Geneva, right, Guinevere. And chapped Arthur, Genevieve, Geneva, right, Guinevere. And chapped Arthur means the cad of Arthur, the battle of Arthur, you see. Cad is a battle. He then goes to Milan. You'll find in Modena Cathedral a nice pre-1100 carving of Arthur and his knights attacking a city, which has to be Paris, you see. And there are names of these knights included, and they all fit. It's Arthur the First, the then he goes down through Italy, gets to Taranto. There's an effigy on a mosaic of him sitting on a goat, Capricorn, you see. But these people are deep into astronomy and astrology.
Yes, sir.
You see. He then crosses into the Balkans. In all Welsh record, he is Arthur, King of Greece. You see, he seizes Greece and the Balkans, and finally Theodosius the Great of Constantinople is forced to gather the armies of the East, and they confront each other in Yugoslavia in two massive battles at Poitovo and Sisika, on Sika River. Arthur returns to Britain and clearly dies, and it can be proved, and his grave exists in Warwickshire in England.
Yeah.
Huh? So then you have Arthur II, a sixth
Descendant.
generation descendant,
yeah.
I can tongue-tied it, of Arthur I. And he mangles the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, is the great king of the Round Table. The main residence of the Glamorgan kings is a place called Keyboard. Keyboard means the mutually together table. It's also got another name, Caermelin. Caermelin, the yellow fort. And nearby is Yellow Wells Farm today. There were sulphur springs.
Go there.
So Caermelin easily became Carmela. Manuscripts of 1106 say Camelot, is Caermelin, is in southeast Wales. That's where it ought to be. If Arthur's a Glamorgan Gwent king, then his fort should be in Glamorgan and Gwent. And the main residence of the Glamorgan Gwent kings is Keyboard, mutually together table, at Caermelin.
Not very far from downtown Cardiff.
Yeah, the embarrassing thing for the archaeologists, you see, again, this is where we get the corporate reputation of universities comes into this. In the 1940s, a young lieutenant, second lieutenant in the Indian Army, visited Mohenjo-Daro, where Sir Mortimer Wheeler is digging up Mohenjo-Daro.
Sure.
In the Indus Valley in Pakistan, it is, not? And of course becomes interested in archaeology. Now, he had no qualification in archaeology, none at all. But he goes to Cardiff, got himself a job, and pity he came to Cardiff. There's 40 other universities he could have gone to in Britain. For God's sake, why didn't he? But while he's there, he gets into the archaeology department. He's actually got a degree in classics from Oxford, which means the study of Greek and Roman literature, as I understand it. He's not qualified to do British archaeology,
right?
And he's no qualification. This fellow's named Alcock.
Yes.
Now, Alcock then persuades later, he's 19 years there, Cardiff University in Wales, to go over into England and dig up Cadbury Hill, which he calls Camelot. If you look out of the windows of their building, where it is, the top story in Cardiff University, you can see Camelot, Caermelin. But he goes over to England, and for 7 years they dug up this hill. Oh, now in his book, you will read on page 163, he says, oh, by the way, everybody knows that in 1536, John Leland, the itinerary geographer for Henry VIII, fabricated and forged and invented all the names from Cadbury Hill, where he lived, in order to make it appear to be Camelot.
Oh my.
No, it's a well-known forgery. And he says this in his book. So now he is dragging a major university into another country from Wales to England to dig up a hill that he knows is a forgery. In the index of his book, you won't find Cadbury Hill. You find Cadbury Camelot.
Yeah.
And he has not one shred of evidence that it's anything to do with Camelot. And neither does anybody else.
And yet the real Camelot, where I stood, is you can look out a building
Well,
and
I mean, speaking sort of figuratively, they could have stood in their university and thrown a snowball at it.
Oh my God.
And you see, now you've got the corporate image of the university at stake, because they're going to look damn fools. But you see, I don't make a fool of a university or of an individual. They do that themselves. You make a fool of yourself. Nobody can make a fool of you.
Do that kind of stuff.
And the problem you have with this type of situation is having put their foot on it up to their neck, because they went there without any fundamental historical research. If they'd done the historical research, they wouldn't have gone there. But the guy wanted to make a reputation and so on. Then he went off to Glasgow University, about 400 miles north, which is a long way in Britain, and sat there for the rest of his natural. Having left them with a gigantic smear on their face, and he shouldn't have been in the archaeology department in the first place.
Well, now, Glastonbury is where they found King Arthur, isn't it?
Well, ancient Welsh manuscripts of 920-ish made for the wedding of Owain, the son of Howell the Good.
Howell the Good.
He's getting married around 920, so they traced his pedigree and his wife's pedigree right back.
To the king.
They've got to go back a minimum about 1,000 years to
Established.
establish it. And they then trace back all the pedigrees of all the other royal families with whom they are connected by marriage, and there's
Right.
32 king lists, including the Glamorgan and Gwent king lists, including Tudrig the Pendragon, Mairi the Pendragon, and Arthur.
And so,
You see, he's there. But of course you mustn't look at that list. Taboo. But the joke is that this is done in 920, and in the list of kings of the West Midlands, it says what everybody would know if you read the histories. That Glaston's is Breton for oaks, Glaston's is Cornish for oaks, and Glastennan in Welsh is the scarlet oak tree. It's a hot oak. And it says that Glastonbury is at Lichfield. Now it says it under the entry of a King Mormail, who is around the year 260 to 300,
Right
AD,
there.
way back.
Yeah.
Glastonbury is therefore at Lichfield. It means it's in the central area of England, formerly ruled by the great King Arviragus, Gwairi, St. George, Gwairi,
Yeah.
given the Holy Cross by St. Illid, Joseph, because there's no J in the Welsh alphabet. Now, that's where it ought to be. It's 220 miles from where they think it is.
Oh.
Glastonbury in Somerset is not founded until 942 by Edgar, King of the English, who needed a mortuary chapel to get himself buried in. Just like Arthur.
Could that not have been a church before that?
I would seriously doubt it. It certainly wouldn't have had a damn thing to do with Joseph.
Well, the charters tell you when it's founded, and that's founded.
942. It's in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles.
Well,
plain and loud and clear.
Arthur lived 380s.
Well, 380 after the first and 503 to 579 after the
So
second.
neither one of them could be buried at...
Well, there are clear. So what they've got is they've got a medieval mess up. St Dunstan's the first abbot of Glastonbury in Somerset in 943, and Edgar gets himself duly buried in his mortuary chapel that he's built, and he set up 12 little monks on a bit of an estate there of an order which is sworn to poverty, and that's him buried in 957. If you look at the records, you'll find records of the burial of Arthur. Significantly, they're all in Welsh records. The Caradoc of Llancarvan is from southeast Wales. It's 9 miles from Cardiff. Llancarvan Abbey is where Arthur, in the records, meets St Gildas. These are in, I think it's a Welsh Hamilton. Anyway, Gildas meets Arthur at Llancarvan Abbey, around 970. Gildas returns from Ireland. Why is he being on Ireland? He's been in Ireland to get away from the disaster of the comet, right?
Got it.
Right. Now, the reason of the meeting was that Arthur had cut off the head of one of Gildas's brothers,
Oh my.
who caused him problems and was in rebellion, so he mocked the king and pushed his luck too far, and there's a big stone in the town square in Ruthin, it's in by Lloyd's Bank, I think, anyway, by a bank, Barclays Bank, and there's a railing around it, and that's the stone where it's been there down the centuries, and right down the centuries everybody says that's where he cut off the head of this guy Hoyle, Gildas's brother.
Yeah.
Chopped his head off on the stone. It's like an execution block.
Right.
Anyway, where were we? We were with this Welsh records. Caradoc of Llancarvan describes the grave of King Arthur, and he gives a number of pointers, and he says it's Arthur. And he gives a number of pointers, and he says it's near the Great Road. Well, the Great Road runs from London to the old capital. London was the great port, but the capital was Wroxeter, Uriconium. Right? Right up there in the Shrewsbury area, and it runs up from London to the northwest, heading for Liverpool, you might say. And at the end of it was the capital. Again, you're into the upper Midlands of England. It says it's Apud Wellis, close to Wales. It says it's near the Great Scropham Scroffi, the Great Scraped Out Ditch, the Great Banken Ditch running 200 miles between the Great Fence put up like a Berlin Wall between Wales and England, you see, by King Offa, around 800. It says it's in the area of Scrobbers. Well, it's clearly Shrewsbury in all the records. Again, the county of Shropshire, same area. It names the tribal people or nations there, the Dibuni and the Cornubii. Any map of Roman record of Britain locates the Coritani there and the Giuboni. Coritani, so north of Birmingham in the Midlands, and the west, south of Birmingham, central Midlands, Giuboni. It then says there's a place there called Apples. Well, Applepeat Magna and Applepeat Parva are still there. And you can go on and on and on. It says if you go to where Arthur's grave is, and there is a place called Arthur's Tuin. Well, Arthur's Tuin means Arthur's grave town. There was a monastery got rid of anciently by Henry VIII when he got rid of the monasteries in around 1534 to 1536. It says in Caradoc of Llancarvan there's a great cemetery there, and there are 2 pyramids near the gate of the cemetery of the monks, and in the cemetery are buried multitudes of the great of the British. And the local council really, they took hold of this vast area, and it's shrubland and bushes and trees is wild, and they thought they'd turn it into a walk and a park.
Yeah.
And as they're doing it, they're finding these huge graves. Most of them are about 20 feet long, about 6-7 feet wide, and perhaps 2 or 3 feet high piles of stones. And they are graves.
Yeah.
They're all over the place. There's multitudes of
Stone
different
grave.
Right near the entrance are 2 big tumulus mounds, exactly as stated in the record, which should be one for Guinevere and one for Arthur. Arthur the First. See, right where he ought to be.
Oh, they both had Guinevere's, didn't they?
Well, whether her name was Guinevere, I don't know. It seems to be fair and true and beautiful one, something like that, rather than it's titular. Most of the British names are titular, as you know. So you've got a clear record of where he is, and if you follow the directions and don't be misled by this idiotic Glastonbury and Somerset of 942-3, you go straight there. And there are the 2 mounds, and there are all the other graves. The place is still called Old Bury, the old cemetery. It is behind what was the monastery, later converted to a mansion house by someone who bought the dissolved monastery from the king, and everything is exactly in place. All the names around fit. Ali, you know,
you don't...
Lowland of the Court, Anley, place without the court, Baddesley Ensor, Slippery Bathing Place of the Court. These names mean nothing in English, but they all mean something in Welsh. You have Ratcliffe Cooley. An Englishman doesn't know what Ratcliffe Cooley is, but Radi College
sounds like
in Welsh means granted free without taxation.
Without tax.
And every name in the entire area translates perfectly. It is a place of kings, because there is a grave mound there, a vast one, which is recorded as the grave mound of Constantine the Blessed, who was murdered by Vortigern, Gwaithfein, King Traherne, around the 450s. And there's too much evidence to give you in this sort of talk. But you find Arthur the First. Well, then you have about 10 records of the burial of Arthur the Second. And this greatly distresses the Glastonbury fanatics, because one of the records is the Perleveau from Brittany, and it tells how people come from Brittany to visit Arthur's grave. Well, 1000s. And they land on a coast of cliffs. Well, that's the Glamorgan coast, if ever I've heard of it. It's a coast of 30 miles of cliffs, and there are only certain places you can come ashore. And they get to a little dingle or dell, and where they can come ashore, and they go up this little valley between the cliffs. And on one side is an ancient church, and on the other side is a castle. Well, you can buy all the maps you like of Britain, and you can go right round the entire coast. There's only one place where you find that. Only one. And that is Glamorgan at Nash Point, they call it. On the one side is the ancient church. It's called Hen Eglwys, ancient church. And there is the grave mound recorded in the Songs of the Graves of King Kerry, who takes over from Caradoc to fight the Romans around 50 AD. And it's there, the gravestone. On the other side, you've got the ancient fort. They go northwards, fine, go north, not south. And they come to a wooded long valley, they go along it, that's the Lantrisant Valley. And they come, it's still there, it's still a wooded valley, and you come to the long mountain. They say, hey, Glastonbury Tor is only a pimple little conical hill, it's not a long mountain. No, but money the guy, it's at Caer Caradoc, and 168 roots of England say Uther Pendragon Arthur is buried at Caer Caradoc, right? And that's Caer Caradoc. And they get to the bottom of this mountain, the long mountain, and they have to go up alongside a stream. Well, you can go there, and the stream still runs down the mountain. Nobody's told it shouldn't be there. And it's so steep, you have to lead your horse up. You can't ride. Well, I see people still going up there today. They ride ponies and horses round, and they lead their horses up. It's too steep. At the top, where the stream breaks out, they find the Celtic hermitage and where Arthur is buried. There, in our excavations of 1990, we found a Celtic hermitage of the period, a rough igloo, an igloo-shaped circular stone building. And the apologists at Glastonbury say, hey, Glastonbury's not a long mountain, the author has got it wrong. And there are no cliffs in this fort and church, you know, they're all wrong. And why does the author say the stream is running down the mountain? There's no stream running down Glastonbury Tor. Of course there isn't. And then they say, why do they put the church on top of the hill where everybody knows King Arthur's buried in the Glastonbury Church at the bottom of the hill? It's all wrong, you know. But there is a well at the bottom of Glastonbury Tor. They will not admit that it's not the right place. So the attack is that the author of the 1,000-year-old story is wrong, not that they have wrong place.
That's right.
Now, there are 10 other records in Welsh manuscripts. The Nennius history written around 800 AD, the Life of St Illtyd, first cousin of St King Arthur, and I could go on and on. The Dwyfnau of Taliesin, 6th century documents, and they all tell, we've got 10 of them so far, of this strange story of the burial, the boat arriving at the river mouth, the body in the leather bag, embalmed body, brought to a cave. The cave is still there. You go into the cave, 11-foot long trench cut in granite, 3 foot wide, 3 foot deep and more, not cut for a peasant, as I've said. Clearly somebody went to a huge labour. Then the body is later taken out of that cave grave, taken up to the church at Coelbren, and is buried. Just above the church is a grave mound on a hill, still on the maps, always being recorded, Coelbren, the Twin of Caradog, the king.
The king.
Just away on the second highest point, at Coelbren, you have Mynwent y Milwyr, still marked on the maps, Mynwent y Milwyr. Grave monument of the soldiers, recorded in all the histories as being built at Coelbren near St Peter's Church. St Peter's Church is the church which still stands in ruin below the Twin of Caradog. So everything fits. The people are said to build a huge fire in a field, massive fire the night before Arthur's buried. Caertan is still there, the field of fire.
Field of fire.
And you can go on and on and on.
It just keeps fitting.
And the church, 900 and odd feet up a mountain, 10 miles to the sea, is called Lan Bad Vower, which means the holy estate of the great ship's boat. Well, he's brought back across the seas in a boat. What's it doing? And everything goes fitting, till in the end there's no one else to go. We then found that most of the manuscripts translated in the 19th century were deliberately mistranslated. Now, I say deliberately because it cannot be otherwise. Because the mistranslations are so obvious and so childish and so, you know.
Why would they do that?
Well, it was all part of this, let's get rid of British history before, you know, William the Conqueror, because it's dangerous to the establishment and the monarchy. We found, they say, in the Songs of the Graves, which is a massive important document, and it's dead accurate. Tells you exactly where the great and the wonderful are buried, exactly where the great and the wonderful are buried in the antiquity. You go there, and the grave mounds are there, and the names are correct, the rivers are correctly named, the mountains and hills are correctly named, everything's spot on. And what you'll find is that it says, you'll find every author writing on Arthur, including the idiots who write on this continent, who I shan't bother to name, from Nova Scotia and California.
We understand who they are.
They say there is one line in the Songs of the Grave applying to Arthur. Well, the Songs of the Graves is in triplets, 3-line verses.
3-line verses.
Every king gets a verse of 3 lines.
At least.
Or he gets 2 3-line verses if he's big, and if he's very big, he gets 3.
3.
Now, how on earth can you have a one-liner? What happens to the other 2 lines? You see, it doesn't fit.
Especially with Arthur's name in it.
Yeah, well, what they've done, they've translated the first verse as Bay the March, the grave of the knight, as the grave of a person called Mark.
Right.
Then it says Bay the Gwaither, as a person named Gwaither. These are not names.
No people.
It then says, it means grave of the wrathful one. Then the next line, they say, Bay the Gugam Glediplod. The means the, so it can't be a name, right? And it means grave of the angry red sword. Now, all these are epithets which are commonly applied to Arthur. The knight, the wrathful one, the angry red sword. Then underneath it says, Anoith bede bade Arthur. They've converted the BYT for so be it into BYD, meaning forever.
Right.
They mangle it.
But there was no D.
No. They take the Anoith, which means a bare exposed place, so be it, is the grave of Arthur, and they convert it to Anoith, meaning concealed. So they're able to convert the so be it to forever, and they say concealed forever is the grave of Arthur. It's a misdirection, you see. Actually, it means a bare exposed place. The next verse then goes on with the description of the grave of Arthur. He's got verse after verse. It starts off with Beth Elchwyth. They say the grave of a man named Elchwyth. Well, this is marvellous stuff, because El is extremely and Chwyth is windy. So it's saying an extremely windy grave, you see. And it then says a very damp,
Damp.
wet place. But they convert that to a name. And then it says, it's a very narrow place. But they say that's somebody else, you see.
Oh, God.
And then finally it says, it's in the field of Maes Meadow. So you only got to find a field name, and all the field names, and every field in Wales has got a name, and everybody knows the name of every field in advance. So we know it's a bare exposed place, we know it's extremely windy,
Right.
we know it's damp and wet, probably a bog, and we know that it's called Maes, and we know it's narrow. Well, right above this church is a field which is enclosed by a vast boat-shaped ditch and mound, 200 yards long, 90 yards wide,
Yeah.
and it's shaped exactly like a ship. Landbad Bar, the great ship's boat, right alongside the church, north of it. In it, at the steersman's position, where a helmsman would guide the ship,
Guide the ship.
with his oar over the side,
Sure.
is a grave mound. And it's a very narrow place, because there's rising crumbled ground there, very sharp drops this side, streams and drops run away that side, out of the bog, and
Yeah.
2 streams run out this side. It hillocks here, so it's a narrow confined place.
And that,
It's on top of the mountain. Below the mountain you have a plain, you have the Severn, you have the Atlantic, and the wind howls in. It's terribly windy, it's very wold, exposed, it's very narrow, and it's very damp. It's a bog.
it's a bog.
And the only dryish place is where the grave mound is.
How big's that mound?
100 feet long, 30 feet wide, few feet high. It's been eroded badly over the centuries, I think. So here you have a grave mound precisely described in the Songs of the Graves exactly where it ought to be. You can prove from what went on there with councils and with massacres and so on that
Battles.
this is Maes Meadow. You know, you can prove it. So we know where he's buried, and we know where Arthur I is buried, because the records are dead accurate. And see, I would find it difficult to see how they would have, here's a nation living in its territories 3,600 years. Why would they lose their great kings and say, hey, we lost him, you know, we lost that one? They know exactly where they all are, because they recorded the fact. It was very important to them.
Unless they want.
No, the English coming, wandering in from Germany, from the pig forests, and sitting on their backsides in the mud flats of Schleswig-Holstein in Holland, they wouldn't know. How could they? And they don't want to know,
So they
because
could
it doesn't suit their psyche.
It could be very easily misdirected and yet still intact.
It's harder to miss Arthur I and Arthur II than it is to find them. But you're not going to do it from Nova Scotia and California.
Okay.
Okay? Accurately quoting what it says in the historical records. That's all we're doing. We're not speculating.
Right.
We're not inventing. We're just saying that's what it says. It names the Awenny River. It names the cave of Iltit. The cave of Iltit is well known. It's there. If they say Caercaranoch in English, 168 histories are wrong. There's Caercaranoch. It's on the damn map today. Where's the Battle of Baden? Oh, nobody in England can find it. Nobody in Nova Scotia can find it. You look at a map of Wales, there it is, right in the Moistake Valley. It's said to be close to the banks of the Severn. It's 6 miles from the Severn. You can see the Severn from the hilltop. What's the problem in finding Mount Baden, which it says it's still called Mountain of Baden? The road going to it, Bob the Cartwright. You read it, Road to the Tumult. You go to the mountain, there's a huge, bare open space. You go to the farmers and locals and say, oh yes, it was fought up there on those streets. They all know. Their fathers and mothers have told them. And it's called Vice Cad Flower, Field of Battle Area. What's the problem? Yeah? Then you've got a big field at the top, field of the White Pavilions. And there's trenches and mounds dug, like First World War stuff. Because they used to dig them. People haven't realised this. You have a trench in front of them, the mound at the back, and it's beyond the mound. So the attacking side is a total disadvantage. Whoever got there first dug his trench. You find these all over Welsh battlefields. And it's hard to see how you can't find these places, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the Battle of Camlan Mountain, Muddied Camlan. There's no mountain in Cornwall at the Camelford River, where there's a stone which accurately translates into a person named in the Songs of the Graves who ain't Arthur. But if you go to Camlan Mountain in mid Wales, you'll find Camlan Mountain, and you'll find the valley of Camlan. It means crooked plain, and it is. You find the grave mounds all over, and you ask the locals, 70-year-old, oh yes, it started up there, it lasted 3 days, and they moved up the valley fighting this battle. But
It's in the,
you read the nonsense of the Jeffrey Ashes of the world, and all you'll find is these places can't be traced. You can't trace the Battle of Longboat. Longboat, you find it on the map. There are farms named Longboat on the Cardigan Bay where he fights his way ashore. A great 6th century poem of Geraint is killed at the Battle of Longboat. You go to Longboat, you find the well of slaughter, the pool of blood, the field of carnage, and all the names. And you say, where's the grave of Geraint? They say, oh, Bed Geraint Farm. Grave of Geraint Farm. You go to the farm, and where's the grave of Geraint? Oh, there it is. The mount. And it's still called the grave of Geraint Farm. And you find a stone there, and a fellow named Bledry, son of a minor king, Mairig of David, is killed in a battle. There's a stone with his name on it, Bledry, standing there. So why can't you find the Battle of Longboat when Longboat is on the map at the bay, where Arthur comes ashore with his ships?
Well, basically what you're saying is that
Well,
the Welsh's history is documented and the English's myths and legends.
well, the guy comes from Nova Scotia and says, oh, Longboat must be Portsmouth. Brilliant, you know. Fantastic stuff. You know.
Really
imagine-
jumped on that one.
Right? But you can find these places all the time by simply buying a modern ordnance survey map, because all the Welsh names have never changed right down history. And you can find where a fellow called Electus was at Moisalig, now Basalig, and he kills Carol, the king, murders him in 296. And so you go on and on and on down these things, and it doesn't matter what period you're in, murders him in 296. And so you go on and on and on down these things, and it doesn't matter what period you're in. They've been looking and still writing books. The English can't find where Caradoc fought the Romans in this big battle of 51 AD. But if you go to Glamorgan history, they'll tell you precisely where it is, and you can go there and see the walls that he threw up and mounds in the ground. But you can't find it because they will not read and will not acknowledge ancient British and Welsh history, because everything stops with William the Conqueror. And if you have this, it's all forged because Troy never existed, therefore all the history built upon Trojan kings coming through never existed. So in the Songs of the Grave, you've got a description and a location of the grave of Brutus. But Brutus didn't exist, he's a fiction. So when you go and you see a great, massive monster grave mound, it's not there. You see? It's only there because you think it's there. You're hallucinating. That's the problem. There's not the slightest difficulty finding anything to do with Welsh history, or British Welsh history. The only problem is that you've got a massive written record which is inadmissible evidence, and Your Honour, this evidence cannot be permitted and not exhibited in court because it ruins our case. So please disallow this evidence, because the man who produces this evidence didn't have a warrant to do it from us.
Yeah.
Right?
Beautiful.
So this is it in a nutshell. It's as plain as a pikestaff when you get down to it. Inadmissible evidence. So they can rule out anything that doesn't suit them, and then they say, there's no history, it's a great mystery. Well, they created it. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah, it certainly does. Certainly does.
That's why I didn't want to write Newton. Newton might be, I don't think so. Bennett can be. English, Tolkien. Edmund English is often a Welsh name, right? A man, a man who's Edmund England.
Yeah.
Because he's a guy that's been into England or speaks English,
Yeah.
so they called him
From England.
Tom England. No, he's not from England. He's a Welshman.
No, but he's been there, so
Been
it's
there.
been from there.
Barry's no Hemington. Butler could be Norman. Butlers around South Wales and
Yeah,
Normans.
yeah.
Butlers of the kings, it's literal. Ellis, possible. Sutton, West Wales. Little England beyond Wales. Jones, again. So there's possibilities, yes. Far possible.
These are the names of the lost.
Johnson stamped, that is Lucas, I think he's in business. Archer's right, Dutton, Allen, Waters, Richard Arthur. Clement, possibility. While Wootton, Midlands, Borden, Thomas Scott, Little, Wiles, Martin, Patson, Darcy, Cherrett, Hewitt, Bird, Bishop Brown, Tompkins, Dahl, Middleton, Payne, Nichols, possibility, Harris, again, possibility. Women. Dare, Harvey, Wood, Powell, Winifred Powell, woohoo. Archer, Jane Jones, woohoo. Jane Pierce, Chapman, Mary Moth. I don't know what that's supposed to be. Sounds like Meredith, doesn't it? Coleman, Lawrence, Warren, Mannering, Payne, Vickers. Boys and Children, John Sampson. There's Robert Ellis, yes. Vickers.
We're ready.
Thomas Humphrey, yes. Thomas Smith, Howe, Pratt, Whiters, children. Yeah, you've got enough possibilities for there to be definitely somebody who could...
Could understand well.
Yeah. Several possibilities of people who could have a relative, a basic understanding, an origin
she's ready,
of
we
grandparents.
honor her.
Right.
So I would say yes, is a possibility that some of these people would, if confronted with a speaker, have known enough from their parents or grandparents or themselves to have muddled through as well. Religious area, which if we find out where it is on the map, see what I'm trying to say, it's got to be in a certain geographic context. The Irish had their religious centres in a certain geographic context of their country. So I explained to you. Didn't it? If you go to Ireland or read the Irish histories, they'll talk about the 5 counties, right? But actually what they've got is 4 counties, like that. And they've got Ulster, they've got Connaught, they've got Munster and Leinster, right? But they talk about the 5 because in the middle here you have Meath. Now each of these counties has a representation, okay? The temples of Ireland, of ancient Ireland, are in Meath. It's like a Switzerland, a neutral area. Nobody fights our wars there. It's the holy area. The same thing happens in Wales. You've got Gwynedd, Powys, Dyfed and Morgannwg, right? And in the middle you've got Gwrtheuyn, the place of the monarch of men, Gwrtheuyn. So you've got 4 areas, but they call it always 5. Now in the Irish record, this area in the northwest is always Ulster soldiers in the legends and histories. This area, northwest, northeast soldiers, northwest is always magic, wizards, religion. The southwest is always farmers and yeomen, and the southeast is always the government, control, organisation. In Wales, Powys is always soldiers, warriors, stories, da-da-da. The northwest, Gwynedd, is always magic, religion, and so on. And the southwest, northwest, southwest, Dyfed, is always farmers and yeomen and so on. And the southeast, where the Arthurian kings were actually, is always government, kings, rulers. So this is the organisation of the state. Now you can trace that right back through the whole of England is split up into the same 4s, North England, Middle England, Scotland. The organisation of the state, the holy areas. You've got one in the north of England, in Elmet, is surrounded by the 4 of Bernicia, Deira, Strathclyde and Brighton. The same 4 situation in the south, centred on Oxford, and there's the same 4 in Scotland for the centre. If you go back into Judea, you find the same arrangement, and if you go back into Chaldea, Sumer and Akkad, you find the same 4 arrangement of the, actually it's like that. It's soldiers, magic, religion, yeomen, farmers, the government. And you find it in Judea and in Israel. No, and in Egypt. No, the trick is that each of these had temples, and there were some others, and the temples had a layout. Once you know the layout of the temples, you only got to find 1 or 2, and you can find all the others. You find the religious zone. Once you find the religious zone, you can map, you can say, well, there's 1 here, 1 there, 1 there, so there ought to be 1 there and 1 there, like that. And you find the others then, automatically. Now, they're well known where they are in Ireland, and we know exactly where they are in the UK, and they're there. If these people came here from Wales, they would have set up the same type organisation, and somewhere there must be the religious zone. And you may well have hit smack on it, because in the religious zone you're going to find the burials and the graves and the religious centres and what have you.
That's why the map is so important.
That's why drawing a map of where these ports were and where they went and the boundaries of their territories is utterly important, because I can find where the religious zone is. The minute I find that, I'll find where the graves are. And you know where the graves are. Does it all make sense to you?
Yes,
It
yes.
does. How nice.
Well, pop over in that chair and let's do the deer.
Nip in here in a second.
Yeah.
Take him here. We'll do it again.
Alan, back when Sir Walter Raleigh brought a colony to this country over on Roanoke Island in off the Virginia coast, came over in the late 1500s, established a colony, went back to England, was to come off the Virginia coast, came over in the late 1500s, established a colony, went back to England, was to come back 1 year later, and of course they got in the middle of the Spanish Armada and were not able to return. When they finally were able to come back, I think it was 3 years later, they found on the island the fort that they had, an earthen fort, and it was totally deserted. Carved on one of the trees was the word Croatoan, Croatoan, or some such pronunciation. When Joey and I were over in North Carolina, south of there, digging around in Robertson County, we discovered over there that there was a legend floating around, and they connected it to the first baby born in that colony, Virginia Dare. No one knew what happened to her. But there's a legend among the Indians that there was a white deer, and that there was this woman, and some of the locals connected it with maybe Virginia Dare had grown up and she had become this goddess of the forest or whatever. But there was the legend of the white deer. Is there anything that you know comparable to that in Wales?
There's no legend of white deer connected with women in that sense that I can tell you about. What I can tell you is that right through the lives of the saints, and I mean most of the saints, there are incidents concerning deer, often white deer. Usually they're stags. And the normal format, one of the normal formats, is that the stag or deer is being hunted by the huntsman, and it runs to the saint and usually flops down exhausted and lies on his cloak and therefore is totally protected. In some instances the huntsman, usually a prince or king, comes up and has to then pay the saint money or grant him land to build a church, because this is immediately a holy place. Now, the deer appears to be the sign of divine providence, and white animals are definitely absolutely divine in this sense. Immediately you have the life of Saint Adolcius, the life of Saint Docco, the life of Saint Duffrey, the life of Saint Ilfrid and Tylo, and I don't know about the life of Saint David, certainly the life of Cadoc, and most of the other saints, where their lives are written, you do have these incidents with stags or deer and white. The second thing is that when King Tudric, Uther Pendragon, the grandfather of Arthur II, is killed, severely wounded, mortally wounded, about to die and dies after the Battle of Tynter and Dindain, a ford on the River Wye, in 508, he's taken away on a cart, and the cart is drawn by two stags. And the Lapshu stags and deer draw carts anyway. And one version also is that stags' antlers are placed on either end of the cart. And so it would appear that stags play a part in this and are usually the symbol of divine providence. So, stags do constantly reoccur, and it's one of the revered animals in the sort of poem about the history of the world. If you read the Bible, you've got the history of the ages of the world in Genesis, and the stag comes into that. So the stag is a much revered animal of divine providence. As regards white animals, if you read the Mabinogi, the first 4 branches of the Mabinogi, the Genesis tales, which appear to match closely with the 7 tablets of creation from Babylon. Well, they all too, the same people. You'll find that a woman arrives with a pack of hounds, and she is white on a white horse with white hounds. And she appears in the sky and is racing across the sky. So the idea of white animals and white things is very much in vogue to do with religion. I've already told you about the Chillingham herd of white cattle. So white is important. Stags are important and inevitably connected with divine providence. Quite what they may be on that. But I've not researched it. I mean, I know of it because I've come across it. It's not something I've gone into. So it would be a Welsh idea, yeah.
Okay. Well, while we've got you sitting here, you've just had a look at a couple of sites on one farm up in eastern Kentucky, the Spratt sites. Any reaction to those?
Well, my reaction, as you well know, is that it's a religious site. It's concerned with Yahweh or Jehovah. It's not only a religious site, it appears, I would think, to be a burial area where the great and the good and probably others were brought either buried or cremated. There is what I would call literature, inscriptions on the walls, certain areas around it, and therefore it's of very great importance. And it should tell us something about the area and about what was going on. The snake sign there, which is Jehovah's sign, the great God, Yahweh. It's in the ground, and therefore you have a Christian centre. It might seem odd to have a snake in a Christian centre, but that's the way it is. So you've got a Christian centre, it's a highly religious area, and it has to be a very, very important site.
And could you recognize any of the inscriptions?
I could recognise, well, everything I saw appeared to me to be Coelbren inscriptions. So I think they could be read.
Okay.
I don't know if that's any help. You've got a cross in some cases with an angle that way, which is an E and a cruis, and you've got a cross with an going the other way, which could be cruis and be cruiba, meaning the end. And but those are sort of a hieroglyphic, almost hieroglyphic rather than Coelbren, but they do occur. They're well known. But the rest of it is pure Coelbren Alphabet, which of course can be read. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.